So the second talk here today this morning is about why keeping it real matters. Building off what Leader was saying about good feedback, students saying that they want to learn something practical that they can use. And today's talk is going to be reminding us why it's so important to keep it real and at least in every lesson teach your students something they can use before your next lesson. It doesn't have to be active. This could be use English or Czech or German in a passive way. Listening, speaking, reading, writing. These are all important skills. Okay. My name's Tom. I've been teaching here for 3.5 years. And when I was asked to teach talk at this conference, I thought to myself, what can I talk about that you're going to want to listen to? Really, I had no idea. And I thought to myself, what has influenced my own language learning? And I thought back to the last time I learned a language in my home country, in the UK. I was at school, and I was learning both German and Spanish. And I fancied myself a bit of a linguist back in the day. I thought, yeah, you laugh now. But back in the day, I really did. And I was getting good grades, and I moved up, and I was about 17, perhaps. And I was studying German. And I was finding it a bit harder. Cases had started to come in, and the lessons were getting very rigid, very boring. We're following this textbook. I don't remember the name of the textbook. That was a long time ago. And I remember about a month of lessons. And these lessons, their only focus was the problem of neo-Nazi music in modern Germany and how to address this issue. I'm 17, and we had to give presentations on this topic in German. And I remember thinking to myself, this is all great, but I'm not sure I'm going to bring this topic up. I'm not sure I'd even want to. And we were going to Germany in a couple of weeks' time on a school trip to Berlin. And surprised to say, no, I didn't bring this topic up. I didn't speak about it. I didn't use any of the vocabulary I'd learned. And I thought, wow, what am I doing here? What am I learning? Needless to say, my German career ended. I got a D at the end of the year, and I dropped the subject. It's true. First ending, no languages for me. Except I learned Czech now. And so when I'm thinking about what I'm going to talk about today, I thought, why it's so important for every lesson to have something that the student can take away and use. So language is effectively just a tool for communication, right? It has a practical purpose. Can you communicate, talk, discuss, understand what another human being has to say? And can they understand what you have to say? And so this is going to be the cornerstone of today's talk. Okay. So let's begin with some examples of how easy it is as teachers to forget, to make things practical and real. So the classic example is conditionals. There's a great textbook, and one of the conditional lessons is Lost in the Amazon, which is great. Except, let's be honest, are any of you ever going to be lost in the Amazon rainforest, thinking to yourself, if I had brought a map, I wouldn't have gotten lost? Well, probably, I don't know, maybe there are some adventurers out there. Probably this is... Be lost with a map. You're not going to say this sentence. And so while it's an effective practice for practicing the third conditional, it is. Can the student actually use the language you practiced in the lesson? And here the answer would be no. Thinking about advanced grammar in all languages, but because I teach English, the focus is going to be English here. For example, inversion. Oh, it's great. You have to teach it for your exam students, your CAE, CPE students. They have to know it. But every student asks that question. How often do you say this? And you think, well, I don't know. When I need to, I guess. And I left the lesson after being asked that question, and I thought to myself, well, actually, I don't use it, not really. If I think about it, I didn't, and I still don't. And this is a big problem. And so I've given a little dialogue And in my scenario in my head, we have John and a student. and they're going on a hike. And they see this beautiful view. And John says, "Nice view, that, isn't it?" And the student, remembering his lesson on inversion, says, "I can use this here. Never have I ever seen such a beautiful view." And John looks round to his friend. He says, "Yeah, you what? Bit dramatic there, mate. You calm down. It's just a view." So these are things to think about when we teach these advanced grammar topics. Well, let's try and make them grounded in reality. Think about your students' needs, where they're actually going to be using, listening to, writing or reading English, and is this actually applicable? Another classic example are topics that the student doesn't have an interest in. It's difficult. Sometimes you think this topic's going to be great, the student's going to love it, and it flops. The student hates it for some reason. And so one of the classic examples of not keeping it real is choosing something that you, in your defense, didn't know, but choosing something that the student simply isn't going to want to talk about, or is going to talk about in their use of language. So these are some classic examples of why it's so easy as teachers to plan a lesson. You know you're hitting the points, you're achieving your goal, you're learning the grammar, the lexis. But does the student need to use this? Are they going to use this? And it's something that I think is really important to remember every time we plan a lesson, to ask ourselves at the end, is there one thing being taught which a student could definitely use the next time they use the language? Or in other words, has the student learned something which they will need and be able to use before your next lesson? Now, I think it's important to understand this doesn't have to be the whole lesson. No, of course not. We can discuss fantastical topics, look at amazing subjects and discuss some key grammar, complex grammar, of course. But I think at the end of planning this lesson, if you ask yourself a few of these questions, you'll start to have a slightly more focused and targeted language goal with your students. And thinking back to what Hanky and Shimon were saying at the beginning about joy. When do we feel joy? When we learn as students. Well, we feel joy, if you ask me, not when we understand it in the class, but when we use it outside of the class. This is when you feel that, yes, that was good, I did it correctly. And so by keeping this in mind, you can start to bring more joy to your students when they can actually use the things you teach them on an everyday basis. Now, I don't mean this has to be every lesson must be some boring business English, work-focused lesson. Of course not. Of course not. This is perhaps some of the easiest way to keep it real, but I'll give you another anecdote. I was teaching this student. He's a great guy, really motivated, enthusiastic. But we've been working for quite some time on digging out some really, really fossilized mistakes. And so every lesson, we buckle in, and we sit down, and we try and chip away at these mistakes, and for a long time, it wasn't really working. We were doing topics that he was interested in, of course. We were doing language that he uses at work, but even so, it just wasn't working. And then one day, he mentioned that he absolutely loves House of Cards. And we had a small discussion about it. And the next lesson, I thought, well, rather than do a topic in the news that he's interested in, rather than do our typical lesson, I'm going to plan a lesson based around the American political system. For any other student, this would be the worst topic, I think. Really? But for this student, he loved it. Because it was language that he could use. It doesn't have to be actively. He could use it passively, every evening, every Friday, every weekend, when he watched a TV show. He could understand what was going on. And he really appreciated it. Next lesson, he comes in and says, "Tom, I understand a few things now. They were confusing for me before, but I get it." And we started making this the basis of our lessons. And I started noticing that a few of these fossilized mistakes, they didn't go away entirely, so we've still got some work to do. But they started to reduce in number, in frequency, because the student was able to use and practice the lexis that we were doing in the lesson. And so it doesn't have to be business or work. Make it something that the student actually experiences on a weekly, monthly basis. Could be anything. So, what is exactly keeping something real? Well, I have just a few examples. We all receive emails from students, and sadly to say, in my experience, those emails could use some work. And it's so easy to forget it, put it in your phone, never mind. And when I was thinking about this topic, I started to do this. Every email my students sent me, which had a mistake in, we corrected together in class. Something small, but practical. You're really working and targeting on functional English on any topic, just about cancelling, rescheduling, times of lessons. Something simple. But we were really focusing on a real language use to communicate with your teacher and say, hey, I'm at a conference on Thursday. And by doing this, I started doing it with all my students. And I started noticing a big improvement in not only their emails, but in all their writing. Because they realized that they were making improvements. Their emails to me improved, and I'm really convinced that through this, by seeing this improvement in this practical language, the other written language improved as well. It feeds back into every topic we do. So yeah, teaching lexis, the student is using at work. I love with my students to find out, what project are you working on? Where are you using English? If possible, can you bring it in? Show me. And they say, no, it's fine, it's correct. I had it checked by my colleague. And you say, do it anyway, do it anyway, do it anyway. And they bring it in, and you look through it, and yeah. Sure enough, it may have been checked by someone, but it's better that you check it. So you go through this just report, this piece of writing, and the student's amazed, like, wow, really? I didn't know that. I had no idea. This is the rule? And I'm thinking, but we've practiced this. We've done this rule before. But the difference was, we didn't practice it in a real, practical context. We practiced it using some authentic topic from the news or some Lost in the Amazon style textbook extract. And by putting it in context with a piece of writing the student had actually done for work that they would normally never show me, they sort of clicked. And this is something that I really like seeing as a teacher. So not only do they experience joy the next time they write their reports, you can experience joy because you know that they're every day remembering your lesson and the things that you've practiced within it and applying them. And I'll give you another example. I teach a group of actuaries at Česká poštovna. And they write 300-page reports on things that are far beyond me to do with mathematics. Okay, no. But they kept complaining that the writing we were doing, they weren't improving. I said, okay, no problem. Can one of you send me, not all 300 pages, please, just a suitable extract from one of these reports, and I'll look through it. And from this, I was able to sort of mock up my own version, containing similar errors, mistakes, grammar points that we could focus on. And they loved it, because they didn't even realize they were making these mistakes. Even though we had practiced these topics, these points, in our lessons, for some reason, it wasn't transferring through to their work. And so when I asked them to bring it in, when we did it in class, they could see the immediate practicality of what we were doing. And it became really easy to sell lessons to students. All of a sudden, I could say, well, this is why we're doing it. We're doing this topic because look at this writing. Needs work, doesn't it? Can we apply the topic we've just learned? Yes. And the student realizes, yes, they can. And I think it's really important not to be too scared by your students. So one of my students, he loves climbing. He's a competitive sport climber. He was a competitive sport climber, fantastic climber, knew his sport in and out. But opposite to what I really thought, he had no clue about the words in English. And suddenly, a big smile on my face, I know exactly what we're going to be doing, what we're going to be learning. And his motivation shot up. His demeanour changed. He used to walk into the class, you're tired, it's 8 in the morning, whinge, busy. And suddenly, he started walking into the class with a bit more energy, a bit more enthusiasm, because he knew that what he was going to learn that day, he could actually use discussing climbing with his wife, looking up climbing videos on the internet, something simple and practical that he can use on an everyday basis. And his motivation changed entirely, and it was really great for me to see as a teacher. When we speak about lower levels, keeping it real could be something like just mastering basic grammar, the basic tenses, keeping these up to a higher standard as possible before we move on to some really interesting, really great political topic or news topic or smoking ban in the Czech Republic, controversial. Thinking about learning the basics of the language extremely well before moving on to more complex grammar. The student's able to functionally use the language. Think about inversion. It's far more important to master the present perfect than it is to use inversion. And it's quite easy to sort of progress just a bit too fast and leave these basic functional skills at competent rather than perfect. And I think to my own language skill, how I don't have perfect use of the basics in Czech or in German or Spanish when I learn those languages. I didn't. And it's a bit difficult when you want to use the language on a day-to-day basis out there in Prague or in London or in Berlin. Because we're not going to be using inversion, back to John and the student, we're not going to be doing this. We're not going to be too worried about getting adjective order correct if we are using the wrong tense or the wrong verb form to begin with. So it's about the student able to functionally use the language as a tool to communicate. And the last thing I think is a big benefit to the student, your lessons and you, is by focusing on something the student will definitely use in this week before your next lesson. You get this fantastic sense of immediate improvement. Again, I think the feeling of joy doesn't come in the lesson, it comes outside the lesson when you get to implement what you've learned. And by focusing on this, the student gets a really immediate sense of improvement. Yes, I learnt this with Tom on Monday, and I'm using it on Wednesday. The next thing is, what does this mean for us as teachers? Well, obviously, we're going to have to get to know our students really well. I don't mean well, I mean really well. Get to know what they love, what they do, how they use English. Really try and keep on top of what they're reading, watching, presenting, talking about at home and at work. You can sell the lesson so easily. Explaining the purpose and the benefits of the activity is a breeze when you can take something the student's actually written and say, this is where you can apply what we've learned tomorrow, now, next week. This is an absolute breeze now because the student understands straight away. It gives us something to aim for when planning. When we plan a lesson, we can go into all these amazing, fantastical topics, of course. But by focusing back on those questions, we can give a sense of purpose, a sense of direction to the lesson. When we put the pen or keyboard or however you plan your lessons down, you can ask yourself this question and think, well, hold on. Is there one thing the student will take away from this lesson that I know they will use before our next lesson? So, this is the question I really think we need to think about when we plan lessons. It doesn't have to be the whole lesson, just when we finish, is part of our lesson looking at something the student will definitely use in a real practical sense, either at work, home, speaking or listening, before our next lesson, and will they get that immediate sense of improvement, which I think should happen after the end of every lesson. Question?
Yes.
Tanya?
What to do with the students who don't use the language?
So the students who are learning for fun and they don't do it. This is difficult. And this is, I think, the role of the teachers when it's changed, is to ask them, well, why are you learning? If you don't use the language in some way.
You might use it during a holiday.
Okay. So I think the role there is to start encouraging them to use media, TV shows, radio shows, articles in that language. To sort of push them as a student to use what you've taught them.
But what if they're, for example, pre-intermediate level, so,
Well, that's when there's some great materials online. Czech Radio, for example, has a great section in all languages, Spanish, French, Russian, Czech, English, German. And they have short news articles about all topics in the Czech Republic. And often they have a recording of someone, an MP3 file of someone reading through the article. And they are somewhere between pre-intermediate and intermediate in level. They're normally not too difficult. And you can start making this real and practical. Here's an English language article about the news you read in Czech this morning. Let's read it in English. I think it comes into your duty to encourage the student to use what you learn, not only on holiday, but more. No problem. Any other questions?
How to adapt it to group lessons?
Now this is going to be the problem when there's group lessons, and this, I think, compromise comes into it. Working with the students to, at the beginning of the course, intermittently during the course, really agree on what they want to practice, where they use English, and finding some middle ground. And this is where I think homework really comes into play, and you can start setting different homeworks for different students, focusing on their interests, on their work. If you know student A uses English at home and student B uses it at work for presentations, give them different homework. And it's definitely more difficult in the group lesson, especially large ones, but it's still possible to keep it practical by being a bit creative, give them different homework. Okay. I think a big mix of both is useful. Personally, I tend to teach it in context more, but I do just some theoretical stuff as well. It depends on the level of the student and their appetite for grammar, let's say. Some students they love the theory, they love to learn and sit down and do it. Other students, they will run 1,000 miles. So personally, I use a more context, but I do use a combination of everything. I think it's important to remain practicing the theory, but then seeing it applied in context. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening to me. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Right.